Hello, and welcome to my review of the third studio album by Irish New Age, although she doesn't like to be considered New Age, Irish amazing instrumentalist and vocalist Enya. This album is called Shepherd Moons, and it was released on November 4th, 1991. This is my second favorite album of Enya's after The Memory of Trees, which was released after this record. And I'm really excited to be able to talk about it finally, because I could have done it earlier, but I kind of want to spread these reviews out. Shepherd Moons is the most sort of interpersonal and reflective and sorrowful album that she's created. Although all of her albums have that tinge of melancholy and have that sadness and lamenting quality to them, although there's also hope and joy, this album definitely is the most sorrowful in its sound, but is very well received. This album was very well critically acclaimed. It actually sold more than her success, the previous album, Watermark. She came into this album kind of shocked and awed by the success of her first real commercial studio album, Watermark, and the success of Orinoco Flow. And she kind of wanted to just center herself again and forget all that craziness and go back to the beginning once again and create another companion album. This album, in a lot of ways, is sort of like the darker side of Watermark. It deals with a lot of the same themes. Sonically, there are a lot of similar sounds. There's some companion pieces in terms of piano ballads that she uses on both of these records, and they're both about the same length. The album cover shows her in this very sort of serene, operatic, deep blue dress, which is such a timeless sort of statement piece. She feels very serene and peaceful, but at the same time a little bit sorrowful. Her head tilted slightly down, and then her neck really, really showing like as if there's this regality to it, but this somber regality. And I really was drawn to this album cover. It's one of my favorite album covers of hers because mostly of the color scheme, and I love deep blues, but also just because of all the drapery and the sort of more kind of classical Greek-inspired sort of iconography that she's heralding to, the classical sort of paintings of the past. This album also draws inspiration from Maxfield Parrish, who is a painter that Enya loves, and she utilizes his imagery in one particular music video for Caribbean Blue. Shepherd Moons, the title track, is probably one of the most blissfully serene piano instrumental tracks that Enya has ever created. The melody is so beautifully tragic, in my opinion. I've always found this melody, it's something I first heard as a very young kid when I listened to her Paint the Sky with Stars compilation album. And I heard this song along with Caribbean Blue and Marble Halls and Book of Days and Ebudae. All of those songs I was introduced to at a very young age. The rest of the album I didn't actually hear until about 5 or 6 years ago. So I heard parts of this album at a very young age and other parts when I was a lot older. So putting it all together kind of felt like this puzzle being finally put together, because it was like, oh, that's where these songs fit in the sort of story of Enya's music. Shepherd Moons is on the surface a beautiful lullaby. It definitely speaks to the evening, to night. The title is inspired by Roma Ryan. She is a phenomenal poet, and she is a phenomenal lyricist, and the title comes from Roma. The idea of shepherd moons, you might think, what does that mean? A shepherd is someone who watches over his flock. Well, the inspiration for this song came from these two orbiting moons around Saturn, Pandora and Prometheus. They are two inner satellite moons of Saturn, and they sort of, as how scientists have described them, sort of stand guard over the rings of Saturn. And this sort of romantic idea of them guarding, the planet, or being like these two satellites, kind of made it this romantic imagery of the idea of a moon sort of guarding its flock, the moon being sort of our shepherd. And you can't come up with something more beautifully abstract and romantic and lyricism than that. I mean, this is probably one of the most intriguing and romantically beautiful album titles that I've ever heard. It is serene, and the sound of this song fits that title just to the point, like where I can completely understand where the idea of what this is about. There's a comforting feeling of something taking care of you, of the moon being a parent, a moon being a guardian, and sort of this feeling of warmth and closeness that you get from the sort of warm tones of the humming that she does vocal background, and the just soft lilting piano instrumental. It's a really beautiful instrumental track. It's right up there with the instrumental for Watermark. I always am at a loss to determine which one I like more because they're both so beautiful, yet melancholy. It's the perfect amount of like, it'll make you cry tears of sadness, but also tears of bliss. This song has the power to calm anyone. Like, it will get your heart rate down. This song is just so beautiful, so serene. Yes, it could put you to sleep. It definitely has the elements of a lullaby. It definitely has the evening time sound to it. But I never find myself wanting to go to sleep to this song. I just find myself mesmerized by it. The vocals of Enya just vocalizing in the background are some of the most hushed and refined vocals we've heard from her at this point in her career, and it just really emphasizes this album's like poignant vocal delivery from Enya. This is a refined sound. You know, it's echoey, it's full of reverb. This album is full of synthetic layering of her voice over and over, and there's some really interesting synthesizer use. Nicky Ryan did a really good job with the production on this album. It's obviously very understated, but it takes it to the next step from what Watermark was. There's a little bit more of interesting instrumentation going along with already the very interesting melodies that Enya crafts. Now, Caribbean Blue was a lead single from this album, and it is definitely one of my all-time favorite Enya songs. It probably would fall under the category of my second favorite. My favorite Enya song is the China Roses from the Memory of Trees. And if you look up my Memory of Trees review, which I will link in the description, I highly recommend you look at that. I talk about why that song is my favorite. But my second favorite Enya song is definitely Caribbean Blue. I remember just being transfixed and in awe of the melody and song when I was a little kid listening to it in the car. It was one of those songs on the playlist I couldn't wait for it to come on because it was just like, this is nothing like, I mean, I was so young, but it instilled so much wonder, and that's what this song is. This song is about pure wonder and the brilliance of the world and being excited by it. You can't help but just feel this awe and appreciation for the natural world and for living and breathing. This song is an ode to many things. Obviously, it's an ode to the Caribbean blue waters. That's but it's really actually just sort of a snippet of the actual picture this song is trying to evoke in terms of imagery. I think it's a great title for the song because she says, "So the world goes round and round with all you ever know. They say the sky high above is Caribbean blue." And it is, but they say the sky. It's this emphasis of possibilities. Enya's more upbeat songs always have this euphoric energy to them. And though the melody is a little bit more on the minor key for this song, it still feels upbeat. It's not like somber by any means. This song is just so smooth and so enthralling with all of the sounds that she has, where she kind of breaks down her voice and sort of turns her voice into literally this feeling of wind. When she sings these, there's sort of these four kind of Greek winds that kind of control like the different directions of the cardinal directions. Boreas, Euenus, Aphroventus, and Zephyrus. She sings those and kind of in this very drawn out and elaborate way that just, it fits the melody and song. You don't really understand what she's saying, and you don't necessarily need to, because that part does feel a little bit more just like vocalization in this sort of waltz-like song. Again, I highly recommend this song. It could be played on the radio, it could be played as a dance for a wedding, it could be a ballet. I've always wanted to envision some of these songs like China Roses and Caribbean Blue as a ballet. Could you imagine, all these beautiful dresses and like this, every time I hear this song and maybe some fountains in the mix, I always would love to create or be a part of some sort of ballet of dance performance of Enya's music, because Caribbean Blue is one of those songs that's just asking for that sort of interpretive dance, because it's this mesmerizing sort of imagery that's just all kind of coming together so beautifully. It's actually really hard to describe, but also I really love the production on this. The opening with that drop at the beginning is just so like sonorous and intriguing, and it builds this sort of soundscape for the rest of the song to sort of inhabit. It's the most beautiful intro, And also, it feels like the song is sort of starting by like coming like a wave, because the synthesizers just slowly approach and then break like a blue wave across the beautiful sandy beach. I mean, the whole song just feels like the ocean. It feels like wonder and bewilderment and exploration, kind of harkening off of the theme of Orinoco Flow. So in that regard, it is like a sister song to Orinoco Flow. It's continuing the journey of bewilderment and discovery of this beautiful world. I want to talk about the music video for Caribbean Blue because it is absolutely beautiful. I highly recommend. It carries the same aesthetic that the Orinoco Flow music video did, where she uses these sort of pastel fine art sort of painting like imagery to sort of blend into the actual photography of the video, to sort of make it feel like a painting has come to life and is actually dancing. There's this sort of very kind of romantic, I always consider him like a Dick Van Dyke kind of character in this beautiful golden suit who's sort of playfully playing with these beautiful women, but it's not like a sexual thing for me. It's more of just like a wonderment thing. I'm not entirely sure. There's an innocence to it because there's also this boy who's opened the book and sees this happening. This little boy who's like learning about all this wonder in the world. And then Enya appears as sort of this sea goddess standing on a beach by a boat. The imagery is so almost over the top, but it's so subtle at the same time. The beautiful seahorse earrings, they're some of the most iconic looks Enya has ever used. So it has some really interesting wardrobes. Everything is just a painting. And again, it was very much inspired by Maxfield Parrish paintings. You can definitely see all the influence that the director used to create this amazing music video. The next song was also a single from this record, and it's kind of completely different from Caribbean Blue, and I always kind of wondered why it was necessarily placed as the next song. It doesn't necessarily carry on the same kind of energy. This is a very somber hymn track, and it's actually, of course, it's an actual traditional hymn. It's a Shaker or Quaker hymn written by an American Baptist Christian composer called How Can I Keep From Singing? This song is covered and sung in churches all across the world, and it is a beautiful church hymn. And of course, Enya always has found traditional hymns to be a huge inspiration for her music, so of course it makes complete sense that she would translate this into her own sound and her own music. And she does a very serene yet somber interpretation of this song. It's very minimalistic in production, and she doesn't necessarily get her voice to soar too much. Maybe I feel like that might make it kind of underwhelming. To me, it's probably one of my actually least favorite songs on the album, partly because it's not her song, though I do love the hymn and it is a good song. It's just the lyrics do fit into Enya's repertoire, and at the same time, it does feel like a classic Enya song, like Enya could have written it. So for that, it definitely belongs on the album. I just don't necessarily know if it belongs at the front of the album. I feel like it might fit better at the end. However, maybe it was good that she sort of spread out some of the more somber, mellow tracks to sort of spread out the album better instead of having them all at the end. I can see why she would have done that. In the video, she's just singing in an Irish sort of ruin. You know, it's a tribute to her own country, to a little bit more of her like Christian root origins. It's a really fitting song for her, and again, it's very mournful and reflective, speaking of all the trials and tribulations in the world, coming and going, and always feeling down, but also finding hope, and realizing you can't, not sing. You can't help but feel hope and joy for the new day, whether that's through God, or through music, or through whatever drives and inspires you. The next song, Ebudae, I think that's how you pronounce it, is a Irish/Scottish Gaelic song that is probably one of the most interesting and experimental tracks that Enya has ever made. It's very short, and a part of me almost wishes it was a little bit longer. It was one of the songs that I listened to as a kid when I was in the car. And I gotta be completely honest, I talked about in my Watermark review how I always kind of thought Enya might have actually been African, or maybe she was Hispanic. I wasn't entirely sure of her ethnicity because I never saw a picture of her as a kid. I just heard her music. This song and the way she delivers it has a very tribal, obviously a very feminine feel. It feels, and it is a tribute to traditional Scottish folk songs, which were sung in sort of this group setting where women would get together and there'd be just sort of this rhythm kept in the background, and they would sort of add vocals one on top of the other. They usually weren't necessarily like lyrics, they were just more vocalizations. It was called a walking session, not a walking session. And so it was really interesting to see her inspiration to sort of create her own version of this kind of folk music. It's not as common of a thing done by native Scottish people today. The Outer Hebrides Isles, which are sort of the furthest west on the Scottish Isles, they are sort of the inspiration for this song. That's where this sort of tradition really kind of birthed, and where it still is to some extent to this day practiced. So Enya is, singing of, those Hebrides, those Outer Hebrides Isles. And again, this version that she sings, it doesn't have lyrics that are necessarily translatable into English. They're sort of just vocal sounds that resemble Gaelic dialects that would have been spoken at that time, a mix between Irish and Scottish Gaelic. So it's an interesting, really interesting song, but I always envisioned hearing this song and imagining these sort of more like Amazonian women, carrying like food and baskets on their heads, sort of marching to this music. It is a marching sort of song. It has this very strong matriarchal, powerful feel to it. And of course, this primal and tribal aesthetic. I just love it. It's so universal in its sound, and yet it's actually directly related to these native Brittonic peoples in northern Scotland, which I just think is so interesting and fascinating. But again, it was not what I would have ever expected until I did the research as an older, as an adult, and understood, oh wow, that's what this song is about. It could be interpreted though as any, reference to any sort of cultural, matriarchal society where women are, working together. And of course it could include men, but this song, because of its female vocals and what this was traditionally a female-driven folk music, it carries that aesthetic so well. It's a really beautiful and interesting song. I just wish it was a little bit longer. The next song, Angeles, which is of course angels in Latin, is a beautiful choral hymn sound that she composed herself. This song definitely has the feel of being sung in a church because there is that organ in the background keeping the tempo, keeping the tone of this is very rich and melodic and cathedral filling. The sounds that she employs of her voice are the most lush that she'd ever do or has ever done at this point. She vocally sampled her voice over 500 times for this song alone. 500 times. Can you imagine standing at the microphone and saying Angeles in different tones over and over again, and then layering them all together to create this choral effect with just one voice? This song is probably not only melodically very beautiful and has beautiful but yet somewhat somber and kind of apocalyptic lyrics, is a beautiful example of Enya's wall of sound. This encapsulates that so beautifully. They did a really good job with using her voice as this choral instrument. Angels, answer me. Are you near if rain should fall? Am I to believe you will rise to calm the storm? For so great a treasure words will never do. Surely if this is, promises are mine to give you, mine to give. Here all too soon the day, wish the moon to fall and alter tomorrow. I should know heaven has her way, each one given memories to own. It's a beautiful, esoteric tribute to the rise and fall of love and life and death. It speaks of angels falling from heaven. It speaks of heaven watching over us as we, Earth goes through all these tumultuous periods and holds us tight. It just is spiritual enough to be Christian, but also spiritually vague to be any sort of, it doesn't have to be Christian angels. It could just be your guardian angel, spirits in general, spiritual energy. And that's what I love about this song, is that she never goes too Christian with any of these sort of spiritual inspired songs. They're vague enough, and I like that she keeps it open. Using words like heaven doesn't necessarily mean the biblical's version of heaven. It can mean any kind of religious version of heaven. She doesn't get too specific, and I love that, because it just paints this sort of epic spiritual kind of picture that you can then interpret your own kind of personal faith and beliefs into to find solace in that song. The next track, I mean, it feels a little bit like an interlude. This is a sister track to the song Miss Claire Remembers, which was on her album Watermark. She was inspired by these novels by this woman, Miss Reed, and this is another song. It's called No Holly for Miss Quinn. It's basically just another chapter from those books that she decided to adapt into a nice, quiet piano instrumental. It is a nice sort of interlude song. It's again track 6, just like it was on Watermark. So she was kind of keeping up with this sort of pattern. That's why this album mirrors Watermark in a lot of ways. Then we come to another single from this album, Book of Days. Probably the most energetic moment on this record. It has the strongest percussion that really pounds and at one point gets really, really energetic. I loved hearing this song as a kid. The lyrics I could never quite understand, and now I know she's singing Far and Away, but I had no clue what she was singing when she was singing it. And it's such a motivating, inspirational song, like many of these, like I said, upbeat songs are. This song was sort of inspired by the idea of keeping a diary and every day not knowing, with a clean page, what to write into that day. The music video kind of follows this aesthetic where Enya's sort of in this most medieval gothic sort of environment, very regal, and she sort of opens up this book and there's like pages showing what's going to happen the next day. It's like this kind of interesting Book of Days, literally. I love in Book of Days that sparse sort of breakdown where it's just all of a sudden this, surrounding where there's chimes and the wind and it's so soft and serene, and then it dives right back in. It's a really beautiful sort of breakdown sort of aesthetic where if you strip everything back, then when things pick up again, you really feel it. You really feel the energy move. The next song, Evacuee, is inspired by an actual World War II story that Enya was very touched by, and Roma, about someone who had to flee London, as many did have to do, during the Second World War from the bombings. And so it speaks of someone who's now separated from home and is sort of writing back saying, I long to come back. The very beginning of the song samples what you'll hear later on in Marble Halls, that lilting sort of humming melody that carries that song, which I think is a beautiful sort of intro into this song. But then it sort of sets the scene with that sort of rainy street with the rain coming down and the horns that feel a lot more kind of classic and a little bit more time period is like adhering. So it sets the scene beautifully for her to sing the rest of this song, which then follows sort of more of a traditional hymn-like progression. Each time on my leaving home, I run back to my mother's arms, one last hold, and then it's over. Watching me, I cry. You wave a kiss to say goodbye. Feel the sky fall down upon me. All I am, a child with promises. All I have are miles full of promises of home. It's a really bittersweet sort of recollection of understanding. I will return to you. I miss you. You think of a child separated from their parents. A lot of children were separated from their parents during the Blitz and during the evacuations from London. And it, the sky is falling down literally around us, but I promise that, my child, I take this as, either the child singing this to the mother or the mother singing this back to the child as saying, I promise you we will be reunited. That's all I have, are promises of reuniting. And that's all that's keeping me going, despite all that's going on around me. It's a beautiful tribute song to that dark period of British history. Okay, then we come to a real fun song for me that I really am interested in, Lothlorien. This song is a complete tribute to Tolkien. Now remember, this was recorded in the early 90s, long before Peter Jackson adopted his Lord of the Rings films, where, of course, Lothlorien is a fictional location in Tolkien's Middle-earth, where the High Elves live in the last sort of age of Middle-earth. And this song was inspired by that area. I mean, it's supposed to be the most sort of element of paradise that was on Middle-earth that wasn't Valinor, which is this basically the Tolkien version of heaven. This is a beautiful piano instrumental tribute song. It's just, if only a little bit repetitive. I kind of wish it wasn't, but a lot of her instrumentals do get repetitive. That's the one drawback to it, but otherwise it still is a beautiful riff, and it really captures the feeling and sound and imagery of Lothlorien. It's deep blues, it's melancholy, it's beautiful, it's so beautiful it's tragic. You know, like it's just this sheer wonder of this very beautiful, rich place. And it fits beautifully with the imagery that Peter Jackson beautifully created with his art department and set designers to, you know, create Lothlorien. I mean, this fits perfectly with that vision. And of course, I love Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films. They were adopted so beautifully. Enya obviously sung songs for Fellowship of the Ring. She sang Anaron and May It Be. So, of course, Peter Jackson was looking to Enya because she'd already done tributes to Tolkien, and that, you know, Enya's always loved Tolkien. She read the books all the time. She really did enjoy Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films. So it was the perfect marriage, and Enya herself belongs in Middle Earth. I mean, her music always, to me, will always sort of remind me of the elves of Middle Earth, you know, especially the elves of Lothlorien. Because the elves of Lothlorien are kind of more wise. They're a little bit more mystical. Some of them still have some powers that sort of the more lower elves that you might meet, like in the Hobbit films and Mirkwood, they're not as high or wise. So Lothlorien is sort of where the elves are really elves. You know, they're like a lot more esoteric. Played, of course, beautifully by Cate Blanchett. I will review the Lord of the Rings films at some point because I just have to talk about them, where she plays Galadriel. Anyway, I could side note and talk about that for a lot, but I really love Lothlorien. Any Tolkien fans, you've got to listen to this song if you're not familiar with Enya. Although I do believe Enya and Tolkien, they just go together like bread and butter. They just complement each other so well. It's everything. The next song is again another interpreted cover song that Enya did not, of course, write herself. It is an aria from the 1840s. So this is a very traditional song from the opera, the Irish opera, The Bohemian Girl, which Enya has professed is one of her favorite operas. And I have heard Marble Halls now sung. I heard it originally sung by Enya, but now I have heard it sung by there's been many versions of people who have sung it. And it was composed by Michael William Balfe. And it is just a beautiful operatic song. But I think Enya does something different. You know, she's not necessarily an opera singer, so she sort of makes it a little bit more subtle and nuanced. And her voice is rich as ever. The reverb is so beautiful. It echoes beautifully because the producer, Nicky Ryan, wanted to make sure that this song sounded like you were in a vast marble hall with high ceilings. And you feel that when you listen to this song. It is so all-encompassing, just like everything of this album. You get swept up in it. And again, it could be a lullaby. It could be a song that makes you want to go to sleep because it does have a little bit of a children's tale. You know, I dreamt I dwelt in a marble halls with vassals and serfs at my side, and knights upon bended knee pledged their life for me. You know, it's sort of like this classic medieval maiden's tale. And it's a little almost over the top for something that Enya would sing. You know, Enya is not necessarily all about that kind of pretentious maiden of the world, although she definitely could be maiden of the world. She could be queen of anything if she wanted to. But the regality and refinement of this song fits Enya so well. And it's a beautiful melody. I mean, come on, it's one of the most beautiful arias I've ever heard. So it fits that she would pay tribute to it in just such a beautiful, sort of refined, very much more subtle way than just belting it out as sort of this big classical piece. She turns it into this very kind of haunting, mellow, melodic kind of nighttime sound that fits it so well. I prefer this version to the aria version by, you know, the famous opera singers, although they're all very good. I'm not as huge a fan of classical opera, so I would find Enya's interpretation a little bit more pleasurable to listen to. The next song, Aphra Ventus, is kind of, again, a little bit of a sister track to Caribbean Blue because she mentions Aphra Ventus in the song Caribbean Blue. It's obviously a Latin phrase, which basically means winds from Africa. Ventus means winds, and Aphra kind of refers to Africa. And so this song is sort of just a tribute, again, to sort of the Greek gods of winds. I mean, again, there's a lot of classical kind of Greek influence to a lot of this. Obviously, with the idea of opera, she's incorporated that. If you look at the album art, she has, you know, obviously this very classical pose showing a lot of the clavicle, which is a very classical kind of Greek posture to be in. And also she has things like some celestial instruments, which kind of reference, some of the ancient Greek philosophers and scientists. So she has, and just the album packaging. So there's a little bit of that celestial sort of ancient Greek and Roman aesthetic imbued into this album. Afroventus, although it's not my favorite song on this album, it just feels like a breeze. It's her kind of just vocalizing to the sound of what wind would feel and sound like as it kind of blows you onward on your journey. And then the closing song, which is the one song that is sung fully in Irish Gaelic, she always has one on all of her albums, is Smout. I'm not really sure. It's also pronounced Smeonim in some of albums tradition and some of the album translations. I don't know how to pronounce it. It basically translates to thoughts, and this song is just basically a pure lament. All of Enya's songs have a little bit of a lamentation quality, but this song is a pure lament to, in her interpretation, her grandparents who passed away, but it's also a lament that's sort of inspired by the story that they crafted up of a large tidal wave that kind of comes and destroys a church and everyone inside of it. It's a very kind of dark story. And in Enya's birth, where Enya's from, in County Donegal of Ireland, she, there's this graveyard by the beach that she always would go to reflect about her grandparents and them passing on. And she does this on her first album, Watermark, and this album just sort of expounds more on that. On the song On Your Shore, she sings in English about sort of being swept away by the memory of someone who's passed on and that grave site that was just by the shore and the waves coming in. All of this sort of influenced this. And now she's taking it in Gaelic and making it this even more sort of epic but beautifully tragic ballad that also features Uilleann pipes, which are a traditional, Gaelic instrument that fits it into the, Gaelic aesthetic. Culturally. Listen to my heart, forever sad, I'm lost without you, and your wife, the great love in your lives, will guide me, be with me always, day and night. Weeping due to the great loneliness, the tears sorrowfully, asleep in the quiet green grave, in a deep peace. You don't get more sorrowful than this song. I mean, this is a pure, funeral-driven sort of lamentation for people who have passed on. There was blissfulness, but that is gone. You followed your husband. The great love in your lives will guide me. Be with me always, day and night. You decided to come and join, she's singing about her grandparents, that feeling of, I want to be with you again after death, and I will be motivated and inspired by your life that you lived so beautifully on earth to live mine with hope and dignity and love. And this just sort of feels inspirational at the same time being so tragic. It's a beautiful blend of both. A thought on the day you were both at my side, telling tales of how things were. I remember the day, carefree and happy, be with me always, day and night. I felt like I had to read the whole lyrics because, again, the whole song is translated. And I just needed to, it's almost so melancholy. And at the end of this album, you might feel a little bit heavy because of all of this. This album does leave you with that sort of reflective, sort of heaviness in a way, but at the same time, it's so light in the production and how she sings. It's not forced. She never forces her voice on this album. And for that, maybe, it feels a little too soft. But I think for me, the softness is what makes this album so serene and peaceful and pure and crystalline, because there is a very rich tone to her voice that comes through on this album in particular. And so for me, although it's not absolute favorite record of her, it's my second favorite because of the just deep blue tones that sort of imbue this with that sort of mournful yet hopeful lamentation and reflection on life and death and transitioning and finding love and wonder in the world around you, but in a more sort of mournful and reflective way, whereas Watermark maybe had a little bit more of that excitement, though Watermark is quite a lamentating album as well. I feel like Orinoco Flow on Watermark is the only album that's that upbeat. But Shepherd Moons definitely builds that even stronger. It structures itself very well. It's a very cohesive album. All the songs feel like they belong and flow within each other very well. Again, there's a little bit of repetition. Again, I wish Lothlorien was a little bit more diverse in sound and it wasn't just the same riff over and over again. But it is a beautiful riff, and again, the song's short, so you don't get too tired of it. But, you know, there's that simplicity, but that elegance, and that just comes through so beautifully. So let me know in the comments what you thought of this beautifully tragic album of hers. It's definitely a well received one. It's one of her critically acclaimed records. She won Grammys for it in 1993 for Best New Age Album. So it won its awards. It's definitely a hallmark Enya record that everyone needs to listen to who loves any sort of classical, especially Irish music or Celtic music, but also New Age music, traditional church music. Anyone who loves music in general and composition will find this album just a beautiful tribute to that kind of music, but also this sort of wonderful kind of escape at the same time from a world that can feel so bogged down and dreary. So I highly recommend this record. I will review the further albums I have not reviewed by Enya up to this point. I have currently already reviewed Memory of Trees, which I said is my favorite. I highly recommend you look up that album review. I'll link all of these in the description below. I have also reviewed Watermark. And the other Enya album I have reviewed is Dark Sky Island. And one last thing I wanted to say is that Dark Sky Island definitely has a lot of Shepherd Moon vibes. I feel like Dark Sky Island in some ways is Shepherd Moons 2.0. Also because the album artworks are very similar, blue swathed in fabric. But that aside, the themes and tones of both of those records sort of mirror each other a little bit, although Dark Sky Island is a little bit more upbeat. And so I definitely wanted to just mention that parallel. So Shepherd Moons, though, I just always have a special place for this album. It's a special, unique color and sound, as all of Enya's albums are. Even though there's a lot of similarities and people will complain that her music can sound very much the same, there is an experimentation and a youthfulness to this album that keeps it fresh, even 25 years later. So I definitely, for that, give it all the applause. It's a timeless, beautiful record. So thanks for watching my review, and like I said, check out my other reviews in the description, and I will go through the rest of her albums in the near future. Have a wonderful day. Peace, love, and light. Bye.